Okay, so the first technique that we're going to cover in the live stream today is the rule of thirds. And now you may think that this is quite a basic technique, and you may think it's one that might be even too basic for a professional photographer to talk about and consider. But actually, I think it's an overlooked classic. And I think the rule of thirds is really one of these foundational composition techniques that actually seems to sneak into so many of my own photos. And I also know that it forms a framework for many professional photographers' images. So while you think you may have already mastered the rule of thirds or know everything about the rule of thirds, it's a technique that's still really important to think about and consider. So as it's a relatively basic one and so well known, this is the one I want to start with in the live stream today. So we'll start with this image. I'll just bring this up a little bit bigger so you can see it's a little bit more clear. So this was an image from the story that I made in central Jakarta when I was making images of these communities living along one of Jakarta's main rivers. And so one day I was out in one of these communities and walking along the banks of the river with my assistant. I always work with an assistant in these type of situations. And we saw this lady who was bathing on the banks of the Ciliwung River in Jakarta. And so I went down to the riverbank and we chatted to her briefly before I started taking pictures. And then I started to create these images. And I wanted to try to get a sense of this lady in the act of bathing, but also give a sense of the surroundings. So for this particular image, you can see that I've offset her to the left. And if we think about the classic rule of thirds, as most of you will probably know, when we're talking about the rule of thirds, we're essentially dividing the frame up into these 9 mini rectangles. And we're using 4 lines. So we're using 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical ones to intersect the picture. And so the basic theory is that if you put your main subject matter on one of those intersections, it creates this pleasing composition to the eye. And it's a very simple technique, but it's a very effective one. And it's one that I've employed in many of these images throughout the story. And you can see in this particular image, I offset the lady to the left. And what that did, it created a little bit of space on the right-hand side, just to give you a bit more of a sense of her surroundings and where she lived. Now, actually, I want to also talk about, what I also could have done differently in some of these pictures, because I'm not claiming that all of my images are perfect. So I also want to point out some of the things that I'd like to have done, if I could take that picture again. And in this picture, for example, I would have liked to have had something on the right-hand side, maybe something on the right-hand line created by the rule of thirds, just to give a little bit more of a balance, because at the moment, the right side of the frame for me is a little bit empty. I love the action on the left. I caught this moment, this great moment as she pours the water onto her head. But for me, the right side could do with something else. It could do with a little bit more work. If I shot it again, I would probably wait a little bit longer and see if I could get lucky and try and get something on the opposite side of the frame. But if we look at this image, this is one image that I'm particularly fond of. The situation here is that there was severe flooding in Jakarta as part of its problem with climate change. It suffers from really bad flooding. And so this one house had been destroyed by the flooding. And so we were walking around this damaged community, and I saw this house that had essentially collapsed. And as I was framing the photograph, I saw this boy, whose home I assume it was, just walk into the doorway. And so by using the rule of thirds, I instinctively moved my camera to get the viewfinder to place that boy essentially on the crosshairs. Now, I didn't literally place him. Some people have asked me if I ever ask people to do things in my photographs, and I never manipulate the situation. As a photojournalist, I feel that we should document the reality of the situations that we encounter. So all of these situations that you see, whether the image of the woman before or this boy in the doorway, these are all situations that just happened and just appeared. And so in the moment, I'm trying to work really, really quickly to capture a moment, to frame the image in a way that is compelling. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but often many of these techniques, like the rule of thirds, which I've essentially been practicing for 20 years as a professional, many of them are instinctual. So in this particular situation, I would instinctually frame my composition to make sure that that boy is on those crosshairs, because I know that that will draw the viewer's attention, but also it will give space to the other side of the frame. And in this case, the other side of the frame is really important to the story because it's the destroyed home. And so there's a better balance in this image compared to the first image that I showed you. Here's another image from the story where, again, another man, very similar to the first image, who was bathing in the port area of northern Jakarta. And you can see in this image how very similar. This time I offset him to the right-hand side and got him on what would be the bottom right crosshair of the rule of thirds. And again, in this image, I've got a bit of a better balance with the ropes on the left-hand side. So again, using the rule of thirds, of course, those ropes don't fall exactly on the lines, and that's fine. But it shows you how the rule of thirds can give you a guide. And again, all of these techniques are guides. They're not hard and fast rules, but they give you a rough guide about where you can place your elements within the frame to give your viewers a pleasing composition to look at. So it's really important to remember all of these are guides. The rule of thirds maybe should be called the guide of thirds. It's not quite as catchy, but all of these concepts are guides for you, really. Here in this image, we've got two boys walking through a flooded area, again in northern Jakarta. And my primary target here in this situation was to get that boy in the foreground, offset him to the left on that intersection. And then very luckily, there was another boy in the background who was walking past that tiled wall. And you'll see that balance by trying to get two different subjects on the two different intersections. That also creates a really interesting dynamic and really interesting balance within the frame. Now, it takes a lot of luck for that type of situation to happen. And sometimes it's very rare for this type of situation to happen. But if you get it, it can lead to a really interesting situation. Now, if you look at the boy in the background, I didn't get him exactly on the crosshairs. And that's fine because composition is not always an exact science. So if you don't get your main subject on one of the exact intersections or on one of the lines, then that's okay. You can see in this particular image, it still works really, really well. That dynamic between the two children works very, very well, even if they're not exactly 100% on those crosshairs. And then the final point I want to talk about in terms of the rule of thirds is that you can actually also use it if you're not sure about what to do with your horizons, for example. So obviously with the rule of thirds, we have two horizontal lines. And if you're unsure where to place horizons in your picture, then one of the things that you can try to do is to use one of those horizontal lines as a guide for where to put your horizon. So you can see in this image, I use the top line as kind of the horizon line for this image. And I also kind of just subtly use the top left intersection to just draw your attention to those smokestacks as well. But initially I was thinking where to put that horizon. Okay, let's use that top line as a guide. Oh, there are some smokestacks. Let's change the position, line it up there. And I also had this very nice diagonal line that you can see in the foreground. So again, these layers are adding a little bit of depth and they're adding even more interest to that composition. So some general tips for using the rule of thirds as a little summary. Use the intersections to draw your viewers to the main subject matter. Experiment using two different subjects on those intersections, like in the image of the two boys walking through the flooded area. And like in that last image, use those horizontal lines as a bit of a guide to help you decide where to put your horizons. Okay, let's jump into your comments and questions then. Um, First up, we have, let's see here. Okay, this one is from Jim Scott, who is actually on my mentorship program. For those who are on my mentorship program, one of the perks is that you get priority comments in my live streams. So thanks, Jim, for sending through this question. And Jim wanted to know, in dynamic environments with everything moving and changing quickly, how do you compose fast? It's a good question. Now, as a photojournalist, I've had a lot of practice reacting to situations which are changing fast, and in those situations, I'm not really thinking about composition, to be honest. At this point in my career, most of these composition techniques are actually quite instinctual. And I've been practicing them for so many years that I'm just reacting in the moment, and I'm composing without really thinking. I'm not actually going out thinking, okay, I have to use the rule of thirds today, or I have to use one of the other composition techniques. I've practiced them so much that many of them just start to happen automatically when I'm out taking pictures. So really, my best advice is that with many of these techniques, if you're an amateur photographer, is to practice them as much as possible. But then at a certain point, you're going to have to let go of kind of thinking about them. And many of them are going to become a lot more just innate within you because you've practiced them so much. So when you find yourself in a dynamic situation, you're just reacting to them instinctually because you've practiced them so much. It's like a professional athlete. They don't think about certain shots that they play during a match. They've become so ingrained that even though things are happening fast, they're 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 doing them instinctually, and it's quite similar in photography. Professional photographers are reacting in the moment, especially the type of photographers like myself who are working in situations which are changing quite fast. Okay, this is a question from Ralph Robinson Imagery, and he asked a question on Instagram saying, "The rule of thirds, when do you follow it and when do you break it? Or is it gospel that should never, rarely be broken?" Another good question. Well, my honest answer would be, like I said before, these are just guides. So you should absolutely try to break these rules when you're out taking pictures. Now, some situations may call for using the rule of thirds. That might be your best option. Now, you could frame an image with the rule of thirds in mind, take a picture, and then you could just throw away the rule of thirds and try a new composition just based on your instinct. And perhaps that might be the best option for that moment. So you should definitely break them. There's no hard and fast guide in terms of when you should use the rule of thirds and when you shouldn't. If you're unsure and you have a bit of flexibility, try both. Try different techniques in that one situation. And then when you go back to your computer and you do your editing or you're looking at slides and prints, then you can decide which one works best. You can decide for yourself. But don't be afraid to break the rules. And again, like I said before, it's quote unquote rules. These are guides that you can interchange and use as you see fit when you're taking pictures yourself. Okay, let's just jump into the comments and before we dive into the next technique. Okay, so let's see. We have okay, so 21 Virtues was Jock tuning in from, I think that's North Carolina, USA. Welcome, Jock. Jock is in my WhatsApp community. You can get access to the WhatsApp community through downloading the ebook that I introduced before. We've got Guillermo who says hello. Thanks for tuning in, Guillermo. And who else we've got? We've got Paul Morgan, who's tuning in from a dreary UK. Well, it's very dreary China and Beijing here at the moment. So thanks for tuning in, Paul.